Welcome to First But Last, brought to you by the Wyoming Humanities. I am your host, Emmy DeGrappa. Wyoming is called the Equality State because we were the first to give women the right to vote. 150 years later, we wonder what Wyoming women think about the progress toward equality now. Let's find out, and thank you for listening. Today, we are talking to Bobbie Birleffi. She is a producer and director living in LA, but she is originally from Wyoming. Welcome, Bobbie.
Glad to be here. Thanks, Emmy.
Yeah, absolutely. Tell me about growing up in Wyoming.
Well, for a lot of my life, I've been that person that people say, oh, I never met anybody from Wyoming before, because I basically moved away after high school, even though I always came back in the summers and my family and everything. I've really maintained a close connection. But growing up was really fantastic. I grew up in Cheyenne, and it was one of those towns, about 30,000 people at the time, where the town kind of revolved around the kids in school, and we got to do everything. So I'm talking, theater, speech, drama, debate, travel all over the state, chorus. We knew everybody from around the state. It was a great experience.
Now that you're not living in Wyoming, but looking back, what do you find most intriguing about growing up in Wyoming?
Well, I think it's interesting that I developed as a kid. I can remember 9, 10 years old. We were out on Apache Street in Indian Hills, which at the time, there was nothing there. And I had a very strong sense of space, and I used to wander over to a hill, which I named Think Hill. And I would sit there and think. And to this day, they haven't built anything on it. It's still there. And I think that it gave me a really strong sense of place, that you just can't copy that if you aren't born into it, didn't grow up in it, that I felt tied to the land. I really did. And the sky of Wyoming.
And so after growing up in Wyoming and moving away, and, having those great memories and looking back at your childhood, and who are the people that inspired you? Why did you leave? And
how did that all happen?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I was very influenced, first of all, by my family. My father was a newspaperman, sportscaster. He was on TV. And this is growing up in the 50s and 60s. That was kind of a big deal. And my mother was really active in the community. And they really were encouraging us to do Wyoming things and support Wyoming and be active. And that was one thing. And the people in my school, the teachers, my sisters influenced me, my older sister, Lynn, my younger sister, who was much younger. She's 11 years younger. My older sister's 3 years older. But they were strong and are strong women as well. And I did things like, I ran for student body president, Central High. I was the first girl. They had never had a girl. And then I got to be a governor of Girl State, Wyoming governor of Girl State. And those things were living, vivid memories of, being a girl, but having some power. And I remember being supported a lot by all some strong women teachers. The choir teacher, Clarice Schubert, was a strong influence in my life. She cast me as Annie Oakley in Annie Get Your Gun. Oh my God, that was, I thought I'd died and gone to heaven to be in that. And I got to wear Miss Frontier's outfit.
That's great.
Which was pretty snazzy. And I think that really, I have to say strong teachers, the debate teachers and the speech teachers. I felt like I was really being called, pushed to rise up and be a strong girl. I remember them asking me, do you ever think will you live to see a woman president? Can you imagine? This is 1965, 64. So not yet.
That's interesting that you talk about being a woman and just the strength you felt being a woman growing up in Wyoming. But then since you've left Wyoming and became a producer and a director, as a woman, what kind of challenges do you think you faced in that industry?
Well, in the beginning, really big. I started out with PBS, with Bill Moyer's PBS, And, it was a friendly environment, but I can tell you that there was not one woman on the shows that I worked on, the early, the News Hour, the PBS News Hour. In those days, there were no women producers. We were all associate producers. Our offices were on one side of the hall with no windows, and the men were all producers, and they had windows. I remember that very well. And it was the now we're into the 70s or so. The women's movement was starting, and we were very agitated and active. And so for a lot of my early career, it was about experimenting and trying to push the envelope, trying to make a difference in the room, because there was an assumption that you could only go so high. And it was a definite turning point for me came in the 80s when I finally decided, I got the courage to make my own documentary. That was a pretty big deal. There weren't a lot of women running around making documentaries, and I chose Wyoming as my first subject. And I was really, really, because I'd been obviously coming back all the time, and I was following what was happening. And the coal and oil business, Wyoming was in the midst of a huge boom, but it has always been this boom, bust, boom, bust. But this particular boom was changing the culture of Wyoming. And so I followed that, and I was fortunate to be able to pull it off. I got some grants and brought a crew out, and it was called Is Anyone Home on the Range? And that really kind of got me started.
And so, Is Anyone Home on the Range? What was the final message you were trying to portray in that documentary?
Well, that's a good question. It's a portrait. So you have oil company executives, you have politicians, Ed Hirschler, Stan Hathaway, but I also had the people of Wyoming, ranchers and townspeople talking, and the outsiders, two women, construction workers who had come from the South, were living in a man camp. They're two of the stars of the film, really. And they're making what they call the Wyoming dollar. It's a $100 bill. That's what they called it. And I think the message was that if we aren't careful, we could lose something here. There's something happening. Who's protecting Wyoming? And so when it came time to show the film, I remember we first premiered it in Cheyenne, and every single person in that film showed up, and there they were all lined up, and they were all opposing sides. But when they saw the film, they bonded together as a kind of a thing. And so I think that the film's message was trying to make people aware that you live in this place, it's time to take a look and care about it. What's going to happen?
I'm wondering about these two women that were starred in the film. Did they talk about what it was like to be the only two women working in a man camp?
They did, and they were tough. And one of them had left her children to come out and earn this money, I think to this day there are women like this that are still doing this, but I'm not aware. They weren't afraid. They really weren't afraid. They were tough. They stuck together. There were just, there was a sprinkling of women doing this then. One was an iron fitter and one was a welder. And they were up there making that sour gas sweetening plant near Evanston that stands today. It was amazing.
Yeah, they would be tough women to do that. And I'm also wondering, since you've made that film and looking at Wyoming today, what do you think has changed? And what do you think is the same?
What's changed? Well, Wyoming is slowly being encroached upon by the world. When I was growing up, I felt the emptiness of it. I mean, there were 380,000 people in the whole state, maybe. Now, there's not, how many are there today? Do you know? Maybe over 500?
Yes, it's over 500,000, but it's not quite 600,000.
Okay. But I can feel the difference. I can feel the growth of Cheyenne, and of course, what's happened to Jackson. I knew that was going to happen because I think that you have basically the 1% has discovered Wyoming, celebrities in the 1%. and it's a playground, part of it for them. And I think that sort of shadow world is probably becoming a little bit more of an awareness to people in Wyoming. And then you have the corridor coming up from Denver, coming into Cheyenne, that someday that's going to be, a metropolis, I would say. So you may laugh and say, oh, it'll never happen. But where are the people going to go? I'm out here in LA, and the topic of conversation out here is how people can't take it anymore. It's so crowded. So eventually it will come to Wyoming. Is anyone home on the range?
Right. And what was your passion to become a producer and director? Was it the influence of your dad and just growing up in that kind of house that was full of his presence and what he did? Did you think that influenced your path in life?
I do. I think I was really influenced by him. And he would talk to me a lot about telling storytelling, about different characters he knew. I was very influenced in it, and staying up late and watching him on TV, and then he would, come through the door and say, "Oh, there's my dad. He was just on TV." And I think that I wanted, even more than a producer, there was a bit of a performer in me. And it was a skill. Being a producer is an everything kind of job, as you know, Emmy. You've got to be able to do everything. You've got to be able to relate to people. You've got to put yourself out, and travel. And growing up, I wanted to see what else there was. I had this feeling of emptiness in space, but I wanted to see big cities. To me, big cities were just like a dream come true. And he traveled for the sports. He would come back from San Diego or Points East or Pennsylvania, and it just seemed so exotic to me. I think that's where I got the bug.
You got the bug.
Yeah.
Has the #MeToo movement, have you felt that make a difference for women in the country, in the world?
In my field, you mean, or just do I think it's making a difference?
Well, yeah. Is it making a difference, one, at all? And in your field, have you seen a difference?
Well, I think that's a really, really interesting question. I am gratified by it. I think that people are starting to use words like misogyny, okay? If you had used that word misogyny 10 years ago, you would be labeled as a radical, crazy, whatever. Am I right? I mean, I think that some of these terms have been made clearer by the movement, and the oppression of men, whether conscious or not, towards women is becoming more clearly defined because of it. And that's a good thing. I think it's time to get rid of these things. I think women are really powerful. I have met some amazing women in this business, in the media business. And it's really great to see the younger millennial women who are really strong too. So I think it's changing everybody slowly but surely. And I think feminism is something that is one of those things. It's so ephemeral, and people don't really almost know what it is and whether it's affecting the culture. It's always, I'm a little bit of a history buff. I spent a few years really investigating the history of feminism and the history of the women's movement, trying to get a series on PBS that we could never get on. They said, well, it just wasn't that interesting back then. But it is. It's something that creeps through the culture. And if you have to go back 100 years, like, isn't this an important celebration in Wyoming?
Right.
Centennial. Yeah, so it just keeps going. It's just another iteration of the feminist movement, the women's movement. I think it's great.
So my last question to you is, given everything you've said about the feminist movement, where we are right now, how can we encourage young women to succeed, and what are they going to face in the future?
Whoa. Think about that. Well, I think as an older woman, I think we just need to be around younger women. I think there needs to be more intergenerational contact, because I think it's fantastic. You know, I'm experienced. I know a lot of younger women. They're great, and there's a real exchange. So I think, you know, if you are middle-aged or older woman, reach out to find young women and connect with them, because they want to be educated and they want to be connected to older women. I can remember being 25 and 20 and being thrilled by hearing from older women or having older women appreciate me. So, first of all, I would say that.
I think that's excellent advice. In fact, that is one of the best statements I've heard on that, because you forget that when you're 25, how insecure you feel about who you are.
Yes.
and where you're going. And if an older woman reaches out to you to help you and learn with you and exchange and have conversation, that's powerful. I love that.
It is, and I'm experiencing it now on the Wind River Indian Reservation on this project that we're doing, developing a documentary series focusing on the stories of the young people there. And both the young girls and the young boys, to connect with them I'm just inspired by them. I don't know how. I think they're happy connecting with me, a non-native older person. I do. I think they're interested. So there's an exchange. Don't ever think there isn't an exchange.
Right.
That's what I want to say.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for talking to me.
Absolutely. I mean, it was really fun.
Thank you for listening to First But Last, brought to you by the Wyoming Humanities. Please join us again next week as we continue our conversations with women from around the state. You can also find us at thinkwhy.org, where we continue the conversation on our blog about the history, journey, and the challenges of Wyoming's intrepid women living in the Equality State. And if you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the show and leave us a review on iTunes. Thank you for listening.